That is all it took. 3 words spoken into a microphone in front of a room full of reporters, cameras, and investigators who had been waiting weeks for exactly this moment.
The room was already quiet before he reached the microphone. Cameras were set. Reporters leaned forward. Investigators stood along the walls, watching closely, waiting for something that had not happened in weeks. Then he stepped into view, adjusted the microphone, and said a single sentence that shifted the entire direction of the case. "I was there that night." There was no hesitation. No visible confusion. Just a controlled statement delivered into a room that understood exactly what it meant. For weeks, the disappearance of 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie had followed a familiar pattern. A vulnerable woman missing from her home. A narrow window of time. A neighborhood that did not fit the profile of random crime. And a family searching publicly for answers. But there had always been one detail that did not sit comfortably within that pattern. Someone close to the timeline had not spoken at all. While her daughter appeared on national television asking for help, while investigators released careful updates, while the community searched the surrounding area, one person remained completely silent in public. No interviews. No statements. No visible urgency. And then, without warning, that silence ended. What made that moment stand out was not just what was said, but when it was said.
I'm going to bring her on. She's going to explain what she learned, but she reported exclusively that they actually do have a potential suspect in the case, and the identity is rather shocking.
Weeks after Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her home in the Catalina Foothills of Tucson, Arizona, her son-in-law, Tommaso Cione, confirmed he had been inside that house during the hours that now defined the investigation. The question that followed was immediate. If he was there, what happened during the time Nancy Guthrie was last known to be alive? Because the timeline had already raised serious concerns. Her doorbell camera went offline at 1:47 in the morning. Motion was detected later, but no footage was saved. By 2:28 a.m., her pacemaker monitoring app had disconnected from her phone. And by sunrise, she was gone. No signs of forced entry. No clear indication of how she left. No confirmed explanation. That sequence alone was enough to keep investigators focused. But the admission placed someone inside that timeline. Someone with knowledge of the home. Someone with proximity to the final hours before everything changed. And that shifted the weight of every detail that followed. Because in cases like this, presence is not a minor detail. It is the starting point of reconstruction. It determines who saw what, who heard what, and who can explain what happened during the only window that matters. The room understood that. The investigators understood that. And the reporters, many of whom had been covering the case since the first day, recognized that this was not just another update. This was a turning point. Because up until that moment, the story had been built around absence. Now it included presence. And presence brings responsibility. Viewers, if someone close to a case like this stayed completely silent for weeks and then suddenly admitted being there that night, would that raise questions for you, or would you see it as normal legal caution? That question sits at the center of everything that follows. Because silence can mean many things. It can be advice from legal counsel. It can be an effort to avoid interfering with an investigation. Or it can be something else entirely. And in this case, the silence did not end with a simple explanation. It continued with something that introduced an entirely new layer. After confirming he was inside the house, Tommaso Cione added another statement. She was not alone. 2 words that expanded the scope of the investigation in a way that had not been publicly confirmed before. A second person inside the home. Not identified. Not explained. Not previously disclosed. And suddenly, the timeline was no longer about one person's movements. It was about multiple individuals inside a locked environment during a narrow window where an 84-year-old woman disappeared without a trace. That changes how investigators approach everything. Because now the focus is no longer just on what happened. It becomes about who was present, who had access, and who can account for the time between the last known activity and the moment the house was found quiet the next morning. And that is where the questions begin to multiply. Because if two people were inside that home, and Nancy Guthrie did not leave on her own, then the answers are not somewhere far away. They are inside that house. Inside that timeline. And possibly already known by someone who has not yet explained them publicly.
The source that I have is impeccable, and he said that not only were the cameras smashed, plural cameras smashed, so that the suspect likely knew about the locations of them, but that the car belonging to the sister of Savannah Guthrie, Annie Guthrie, was towed, impounded, and taken into evidence.
This is a real case involving a missing person, and some details may be difficult to hear. Viewer discretion is advised. What happens next in this investigation is not built on speculation alone. It is built on a sequence of recorded moments, digital gaps, and statements that do not fully align. And when those pieces are placed side by side, they begin to form a pattern that investigators are still working to understand. Because the disappearance itself is only one part of the story. The timeline is another. The silence is another. And now, the admission has added something else. A second presence that had not been part of the public record until that moment. If you are following this case closely, make sure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on, because what comes next will move beyond statements and into the exact sequence of events that took place that night. And once that timeline is fully laid out, one detail stands out in a way that is difficult to ignore. Something inside that house stopped working at a very specific time. And it may be the key to understanding exactly when everything changed. The timeline did not begin with a disappearance. It began with routine. Nancy Guthrie had lived in the same home for decades in the Catalina Foothills area of Tucson, Arizona. Her days followed a consistent structure. Meals at regular hours. Medication taken on schedule. Doors secured at night. Communication with family that followed a pattern strong enough that any break in it would be noticed quickly. That consistency is what makes the events of January 31st into February 1st, 2026 stand out with unusual clarity. Because when routine breaks without explanation, investigators treat that moment as the starting point. In this case, that moment is measured in minutes. At 1:47 a.m., Nancy's doorbell camera stopped transmitting. Systems like that do not typically shut down without cause. It marked the first disruption. At 2:12 a.m., motion was detected on the property. The system recorded the event, but no footage was saved. That detail created an early question. Movement was registered, but the visual record was missing. By 2:28 a.m., her pacemaker monitoring application disconnected from her phone. The connection stopped, but the device itself would have continued logging internally. Between those timestamps, something changed inside that house. When family members arrived later that morning, the environment did not show signs of forced entry. Personal items were still in place. Her phone remained inside. Medication had not been taken. Those details narrow possibilities. They suggest Nancy did not prepare to leave. They suggest she did not expect to be gone. And they suggest whoever was present that night had either been allowed inside or already had access. That is where the timeline becomes more than a sequence. It becomes a constraint. Because any explanation must fit within those minutes. Investigators work backward from the last known activity. They examine what stopped first, what followed, and what never resumed. Each gap becomes a question. Why did the camera stop at that exact time? Why was motion detected without footage? Why did the device connection end when it did? And how do those events align with the presence now confirmed inside the home? The admission that someone was there during that window places a human element directly into a technical timeline. That matters because data does not adjust to statements. It remains fixed. If someone describes what happened, investigators compare that account to the recorded sequence. The alignment, or lack of it, becomes part of the evaluation. In this case, the sequence is tight. Less than an hour separates the first disruption from the last recorded signal.
And this is the wording. It's very important. The wording is very important. He said they now believe the son-in-law may be the prime suspect. Those are the words. Son-in-law may be the prime suspect at this point.
Within that hour, the conditions inside the house changed enough that an 84-year-old woman was no longer there by morning, and no clear explanation was visible from the outside. That is not a wide timeline. It is a controlled one. And controlled timelines tend to involve controlled access. Which brings the focus back to the people inside. Because if the environment was not forced, then entry was either permitted or already established. And if more than one person was present, then each of those individuals becomes part of the same limited window. The timeline does not expand to accommodate uncertainty. It narrows around it. And as it narrows, it begins to press against statements, against silence, and against the details that have not yet been explained publicly. Because one detail in that sequence does not just indicate when something stopped. It may indicate when something started. If you are following this investigation closely, make sure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on, because the next part of this case moves from the timeline itself to the behavior of the people inside it. And that shift raises a question that has remained at the center of public attention since the beginning. Why did one person remain silent while everything else was moving? The timeline created pressure. The silence gave it direction. In the days following Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, public attention settled into a familiar pattern. Law enforcement released controlled updates. Community members organized searches. Media coverage expanded beyond the local area. At the center of that public response was Nancy's daughter, Savannah Guthrie. She spoke clearly, consistently, and with urgency. She appeared in interviews. She addressed the public. She asked for information. That kind of visibility shapes perception. It signals concern. It signals cooperation. It signals a willingness to engage openly with the search for answers. But alongside that visibility was a contrast that became increasingly difficult to ignore. Another person, equally connected to the final known timeline, was not visible in the same way. Tommaso Cione, Nancy's son-in-law, remained in the background. He was present within the family structure. His connection to the home was known. His proximity to the timeline would later be confirmed. But during the critical early days of the investigation, he did not speak publicly. No interview requests were accepted. No direct appeals were made. No personal statement was issued addressing the disappearance. Silence, in itself, is not evidence. There are legitimate reasons someone might avoid public comment. Legal guidance often recommends limiting statements during an active investigation. Public exposure can complicate timelines and introduce misinterpretation. But in high-profile cases, silence can also become a focal point. Not because it proves anything, but because it stands in contrast to everything else happening around it. In this case, that contrast grew sharper over time. Family members were asking for help. Law enforcement was urging the public to come forward. Media coverage was expanding the story. And one person, closely connected to the final hours, remained publicly inactive. That gap did not go unnoticed. It became a question. Why remain silent when others were speaking? And more specifically, why maintain that silence when the timeline itself placed importance on anyone present during those hours? Journalists began to raise that question more directly. Among them was reporter Brian Entin, who addressed the issue in coverage of the case. The focus was not an accusation. It was a request for clarity. Because in cases like this, clarity reduces speculation. And the absence of it tends to produce the opposite. There are two ways to interpret that silence. One is procedural. Legal counsel may advise against public statements to prevent misinterpretation, to avoid influencing witness testimony, or to ensure that any communication aligns with verified information. The other interpretation is less procedural. It suggests that silence may exist because there are details not yet disclosed, or not yet prepared to be addressed publicly. Both interpretations can exist without contradiction. And that is what makes silence a complicated element in an investigation. It does not provide answers. It raises questions. Those questions remained unresolved until the moment that silence ended. And when it did not resolve the tension. It increased it. Because the statement that followed did not close the gap between what was known and what was not. It widened it. If you are following this case, make sure you are subscribed and notifications are turned on, because the next development does not simplify the situation. It introduces something that investigators had not confirmed publicly until that point. A second presence inside the house. And that changes the structure of the entire investigation. The statement was brief, but its impact was immediate. I was there that night. With that confirmation, Tommaso Cione placed himself directly inside the timeline that investigators had been examining since the first day. It was no longer an assumption or a possibility. It was a declared fact. Presence brings expectation. Once someone confirms they were inside a location during a critical window, the next step is clarity. What was seen? What was heard? What occurred during the period that now defines the case? But the statement did not move immediately into detail. Instead, it added another element. She was not alone. That sentence expanded the scope of the investigation beyond a single confirmed presence. It introduced a second individual inside the home during the same time frame. No name was provided at that moment. No role was explained publicly. No clear description of that person's involvement was offered. But the implication was clear. There were at least 2 people inside the house during the hours Nancy Guthrie disappeared. That shifts the structure of the timeline. Because now investigators are not reconstructing a sequence involving one person's movements. They are evaluating interactions. Who entered the home? Who was already there? Who moved through the property during the period when systems were disrupted? And how those movements align with the technical data already established. That is where the case begins to intersect with recorded information. Nancy's pacemaker is not simply a medical device. It is a monitoring system that logs heart activity continuously. It records changes in rate. It tracks irregular patterns. It timestamps events internally. Even when disconnected from external applications, the device itself continues functioning. That means the timeline inside the body remains intact, even if external connections are interrupted. Investigators familiar with such devices understand their value. They do not provide a visual account. They do not identify individuals. But they can indicate moments of change. Moments where the body responds to stress, movement, or sudden shifts in condition. When aligned with external timestamps, those internal logs can help narrow down when something occurred. That is why the disconnection at 2:28 a.m. is not treated as an endpoint. It is treated as a reference point. Because the device did not stop recording. It only stopped transmitting. Alongside that, investigators reviewed the home's security system. Early findings indicated that certain periods of expected footage were not available. The absence did not appear random. It aligned with specific segments of the timeline. Reports indicated the system had been accessed using correct credentials. That detail matters. It suggests familiarity. Not an external breach, but internal knowledge of how the system operates and how to access it. When those elements are placed together, the picture becomes more structured. A confirmed presence. A second individual. A narrow timeline. A system disruption that aligns with activity. And a device that may contain a continuous internal record. Each piece, on its own, raises a question. Together, they begin to form a sequence that investigators are working to interpret carefully. Because interpretation must follow evidence. And evidence must align across sources. Statements, digital records, and physical timelines must support each other. If they do not, that gap becomes part of the investigation. If you are following closely, make sure you are subscribed and notifications are turned on, because the next phase of this case does not focus on what was said. it focuses on what does not fully align. And that is where the investigation becomes more complex. The case now sits between what is known and what has not been fully explained. Nancy Guthrie remains missing. The timeline of January 31st into February 1st, 2026 is defined by precise timestamps, confirmed disruptions, and a limited window that continues to guide the investigation. What is confirmed publicly is clear. An 84-year-old woman disappeared from her home without signs of forced entry. A doorbell camera went offline at 1:47 a.m. Motion was detected later without recorded footage. A pacemaker monitoring connection ended at 2:28 a.m. Her son-in-law, Tommaso Chione, has publicly stated he was present inside the home that night. He has also confirmed that another person was present. Beyond those points, the case enters a space where details are either still under investigation or not publicly confirmed. Reports have referenced missing segments of security footage and access through valid credentials. There have been mentions of communication activity following the timeline window. These elements have been discussed in connection with the case but have not all been formally confirmed in official statements. That distinction matters, because investigations are built on verified information, not assumptions. At the same time, public attention continues to focus on the gaps. The identity of the second person has not been fully clarified in public reporting. The sequence of events inside the home during the critical window has not been reconstructed publicly in detail. And the alignment between statements and recorded data has not been fully explained. Those gaps are where the case remains open. There are two ways to view the current situation. One is that investigators have more information than has been released and are building a structured case before making further statements. The other is that key elements are still being determined, and the timeline has not yet been fully resolved. Both possibilities exist within ongoing investigations. And both reinforce the same reality. The case is not closed. Behind every timestamp is a moment that needs explanation. Behind every statement is a comparison to recorded data. And behind every unanswered question is a family waiting for clarity. Public discussion has added another layer to the case. Speculation can move quickly. It can focus attention, but it can also create pressure on individuals who have not been formally identified as suspects. That is why balance matters. Questions are part of the process. But conclusions require evidence. As of now, no individual has been publicly charged in connection with Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. The investigation remains active. The timeline remains central. And the admission that placed multiple people inside that timeline remains one of the most significant developments. Because it anchors the case to a specific place, specific window, and a limited number of individuals who can account for what happened. If you have followed this case from the beginning, continue to stay engaged. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because any confirmed update will change how this timeline is understood. And share your perspective in the comments, because thoughtful discussion can help keep attention on the facts that matter. The question that remains is direct. If two people were inside that home during the critical hours, and one of them has now confirmed it publicly, what explains the gap between the last recorded signal and the moment Nancy Guthrie was found missing? That answer exists somewhere within the timeline. It is either already known and not yet disclosed, or it has not yet been fully uncovered. And until that changes, the case remains defined by one thing. A sequence of events that started with a disruption at 1:47 a.m. and ended with a question that has not been answered.